Today it is our delight to be speaking with Professor Robin M. Jensen. Dr. Jensen is the Patrick O'Brien Professor of Theology at Notre Dame University. Trained in both the history of art and the history of Christian doctrine and liturgy, Dr. Jensen's teaching and research explores the intersections among Christian theology, liturgical practice, and material and visual culture. She is particularly attentive to the interpretation of Christian art and architecture in light of its ritual functions and religious significance. She's the author of many books and articles, including the book that we'll be discussing today, Christianity in Roman Africa, the development of its practices and beliefs. And because of this book's unique stature, I'm going to turn it this direction for our viewers as well. This is an enormous work. Well, I have the book open. I'm also going to show you the inside of the book. We have dozens of pages, over 150 gorgeous color photographs. The book is co-authored with her husband, J. Patu Burns, and examines the lived practice of ancient Christianity as reflected in both material and documentary evidence. She's a very busy scholar. Numerous other books could be mentioned, but two other projects that she's currently working on include The Cross, History, Art, and Controversy, publication for Harvard University Press, and also the Rutledge Companion to Early Christian Art and the Cambridge History of Late Antique Archaeology. Dr. Jensen, we're thrilled to have you this morning.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here.
Dr. Jensen, as we begin, if you would just speak about the genesis of this project. It's an enormous book, 670 pages, hundreds of color and black and white pictures and diagrams. This is the fruit of a gargantuan project. How did this book come about?
It's a long story. It actually came about around 20 years ago, began to be sort of conceived. I was actually at a meeting at the North American Patristics Society and had met Patu Burns, who was not my husband at that time, and he was giving a keynote address on Augustine and his ideas that he was using some of the work of Mary Douglas in ritual studies to see whether he could account for some of the development, some of doctrinal developments in North Africa on the basis of, let's say, sort of social context, human problems, circumstances that would have arisen in a community. And I was really taken with this idea. It was just a different way of approaching this, as opposed to sort of doctrines kind of falling out of the sky, you know, and having no particular genesis outside of the brain, or maybe God's brain. And so I asked him at the time if he'd ever been to North Africa, because I actually had just been giving a keynote address on having traveled and looking at baptistries, and mostly in Tunisia. And we sort of started talking about what it would be like to gather a group of scholars to do some collaborative work. Archaeologists, art historians, text historians. And at the time, we really put together a small team. We got an NEH grant for this, and we went, a group of us, to North Africa. And it was wonderful, sort of having a chance to sort of see things together, and from the different perspectives that we had and the different kinds of training we had, to kind of begin to unpack the sort of not just the nature of Christianity in North Africa, but how actually people lived that religion and lived their faith. And so we were actually able to kind of reconstruct rituals and spaces in which they would have been performed. We were able to walk around in Augustine's Basilica and Hippo later and really reconstruct the movements that might have taken place in a worship service with a Eucharistic liturgy, where the altar would have been placed, how many people could stand there, how you would make that work, what that would mean. And I think in my years of sort of looking at the intersections of ritual with space and image, there's so many ways in which these sort of non-textual elements shape the ways we know things and the ways we think about what we're doing when we're in worship, and receiving the sacraments. So where we stand, what we hold, what we do, what we see, what's around us. This is also part of our theological experience and religious experience. So in able to really put that together in conversations with these others was a really good collaborative exercise. Over the years, we kept meeting. Our group expanded and contracted, and presenting papers at different conferences. And ultimately, it was sort of everybody sort of said, "It's up to you two. You're going to write up this book." But I have to say, quite fairly, and it's really important to say this, that this was the product of a lot of people's ideas.
It's absolutely marvelous. And thank you for sharing that. The work that you put together is pioneering. I'm a patristic scholar. I read lots of texts dealing with ancient Christianity, but very few of them are conscious or deal with any sophistication with the material culture. So this is just a marvelous pioneering work that you put together. Let me ask some questions. Some of the questions that come to us from the traditional studies and left unanswered, and perhaps this new research methodology can engage in a way that textual studies can't. Let's talk about ancient baptistries for a moment. You've published other books on ancient baptistries as well. Does this type of research help us understand how widespread the practice of baptism by immersion versus sprinkling was, for example?
I do think it can. I'll change your question just slightly to talk about the difference between baptism by immersion and submersion. And so I don't know how common sprinkling would have been, except maybe in places where there really wasn't much access to water. If somebody was on a sickbed, for example, and dying, we do have instances of that. And so possibly sprinkling would have been practiced in those instances. But when we actually have a baptismal font, and we do have a lot of them, and they're wonderful, wonderful, beautiful spaces, I think people were at least very thoroughly wet. Now, that doesn't mean they got their heads underwater. And I have to give a little footnote here, and a word of praise to Everett Ferguson's big book on baptism. He has written what is probably the most comprehensive work on early Christian baptism that is out there. And it would be fair to say that Everett Ferguson and I don't quite agree on this. It may be just on the differences between complete submersion, head under the water, versus what I would call immersion, which would mean that one would get a lot of water scooped over your head, perhaps. And I think this is, for me, it has less to do with my own ecclesial tradition, which of course practices sprinkling, than looking at the size and depth of baptismal fonts and the shape of baptismal fonts. Many of them were probably really too small to accommodate real submersion. And we have some good reason to think that I would envision this is that somebody would probably get down on their knees, kneel in the font, and be thoroughly covered with water, maybe with a group of deacons helping to scoop water over the head. And that actually conforms pretty well to the artistic evidence and depictions of baptism in the early church. So you kind of get two pieces of things that are going together. What I do say to my students is that you will see primarily an emphasis on adult baptism, and I think pretty thorough washing.
Now that's very helpful because, for example, I've been confused as I look at images of the baptistry at Dura Europas or something like that, where it's a it looks to me like a baptismal tank of sorts, but it's not deep enough for somebody to get down under the water, and so I haven't been able to envision exactly what's taking place. But when you point my imagination to various Christian art pieces, thank you for that. Suddenly you're helping me make a connection there.
And a lot of people know that baptistry at Dura Europas, and I think that's a unique one, actually. We have very few that are shaped like that. Most of the ones that we would have, even from Italy, or from the West in particular, but even from the East, are going to be cruciform shaped, octagonally designed, or sometimes what we call quadrilobe, sort of like four, like petals of a flower, sometimes four, sometimes eight, sometimes six. And they have steps down in, and once you get at the bottom, there really isn't room for more than about one person to sort of kneel. And you either if you think about this, and if you think about somebody being actually nude,
Mhm.
I don't think people would really want to lie back in those fonts anyway. They probably would kind of curl up into sort of a fetal position, and it would be very birthing. The imagery would be very much of birthing.
Hmm.
So I think that really works better, and I think that conforms to what we see in the art and what we see in the architectural spaces.
Mhm. It's absolutely fascinating. Dr. Jensen, what have you learned about the practice of the Eucharist? Many of our contemporary discussions of Eucharistic theology since the Reformation center around the mode of Christ's presence in the bread and the wine. From your study of the ancient spaces of Christian worship, what were the questions being asked of the Eucharist at this time?
This is a really good case in which we try to put together texts and space. And I would say that in the texts, someone might disagree with me, but I think within the text, we don't see so much debate over the nature of Christ's presence, at least not in the West, not in Africa. Everybody agreed that Christ was present, but nobody tried to figure out exactly how that was. You know, we didn't talk about transubstantiation so much, or those sorts of things. It's a really later discussion. So everybody sort of agreed that Christ is present. I think what you see in Africa, and this might be very unique to Africa, but I won't say that for sure, is that Christ is present in the ecclesial community. So one of the things that I've been really busy with is thinking about a lot is that altars are in this often very close into the center of the space, the church nave. They're not high on a platform and at the back. So the congregation would understand. I have to visualize the congregation gathered around the altar. I don't know which way the celebrant faced. I'm willing to guess that the celebrant might have faced the same direction as the congregation, as a kind of leader of the people, and not as the behind the table as a presenter of self in persona Christi. So what I'm sort of envisioning is that the presider or the celebrant of the sacrament, the bishop usually, would likely face the same direction as the rest of the people, in a sense as a kind of representative of the body, and not as somebody who would present himself as the figure of Christ behind a table. That I have some evidence for based on where steps are and the orientation of some of the iconography in spaces. So we're taking this together. I think that for something like Augustine and his church in Hippo, the Eucharist was a symbol of the ecclesial community, the body of Christ as a community, not as only as elements, physical elements on the table. So there's the physical presence in the elements, but there's also the physical presence of Christ in the community. And if you gather around that table, you really do instantiate that idea. Now that conforms to Augustine's own text and his own words in his sermons, in which he talks about what the Eucharist is. And so that's a good way of putting it together, I think. You can see how it worked out in space, and it really does conform nicely.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that reflection. Dr. Jensen, in chapter 9 of your text, you discuss marriage, virginity, and widowhood. And Augustine of Hippo was often criticized for his apparently very negative attitude towards sexuality, as some of the other church fathers as well. When we look at them in their historical context, particularly Augustine in North Africa, do we become any more sympathetic to his views on sexuality? How do we understand that as moderns?
I think he was actually one of the more, for his time, one of the more liberal thinkers on that. So I will defend him, but I think it's hard for us in our contemporary ideas about this to really understand, you know, how sexual relationships must have looked like to somebody in antiquity. And I think from his own experience, the idea we have of kind of mutual pleasure and consensuality just isn't quite operative for the ancient world in the same way, which isn't to say there weren't plenty of perfectly happily married people, but I think he understands that there's something about the sexual drive that is out of control and therefore disordered and sometimes dominating. I mean, sometimes wanting self-gratification over the other, even control over the other. And I think he sees that as a sign of the disordered human nature. In the same way that I think he would see something like greed or anger, rage, where you lose control, where you don't have that, you start to sort of think only of yourself and meeting your own needs first. And which, I'm not trying to say that's what sex is. I think that's how he saw it. And if you sort of see it that way, you can understand. I often have to remind my students, we have a lot of problems with sex in this world. We have child pornography to think. There are ways in which we have to acknowledge that this is a complicated drive, not always for good. And so I think as a man of his time, that is how he saw it. He's one of those wonderful instances where we know he knows it from his own experience and has really reflected on his own experience of this, as opposed to judging others. He's really, and in many of his sermons, he's really generous to his congregation around these things. And most of the time, he's asking them to forgive one another. And for him, I think the operative rescue of all of this is fidelity. If you can remain faithful and to another person, you can really work on this together, maybe, and be mutually supportive, So I think Augustine the bishop is really a different person than Augustine the theologian. And I think that's kind of wonderful to see how different he is when he's actually speaking to people and he's writing treatises. So, yeah.
No, that's very helpful. I've been seeking ways to humanize Augustine on this point, and that will be genuinely helpful. Thank you for those comments. Good. Chapter 11 is entitled Honoring the Victorious Heroes, the Call to the Saints. Help us understand this, the call to the saints, the veneration of the relics of deceased martyrs and saints. Where does this practice come from? And what does it look like in Roman Africa? And can you help us getting any closer to understanding, does this practice come from Roman culture, from pagan sources? Is this something that was growing properly out of Christianity? Where do we understand the genesis of this practice?
This is really interesting. I've just been thinking a lot about this in the last 2 weeks because I was at a conference in Denmark last week on pilgrimage. And I suddenly realized, and I don't think I've ever put this together so clearly in my head, but I don't think this has anything to do with Greco-Roman religion. I think it's uniquely Christian. Certainly, people who were, we call them pagans, had heroes, and they were sometimes deified. But they're sort of like in the mythological myths of time, like Hercules or something. Emperors could be deified, but nobody really thought, I think, that they were really gods. It was so... And they weren't venerated. So this idea of venerating saints, I think it could be, if it has some roots, it has roots in Judaism, some, patriarchs and prophets. But again, I think the idea of venerating the bodies and the burial places, and not only the burial places, but the bodies of these saints is especially Christian and almost uniquely Christian. And I think if you take Revelation 6, the saints are under the altar and crying out, and, you take that text, which is a good biblical text to support the idea of the role and place of saints, and you also take together the Christian belief in the resurrection of the body, then you have something that I think you start to see the connections here, that the saints, the body and the spirit or the soul of the saint isn't severed. There's still a link. And so things begin to happen where people really come to the burial places of their saints, like they visited the burial places of their ancestors. But now even more, these are the places they come. And they come to pray. They pray to the saints for intercession on their behalf. They don't pray. The saints are supposed to carry the message to God, right? It's sort of like having a go-between. So it's not so much that, Augustine's very clear on this, if the miracles are worked, it's because God chooses to work the miracle at the intercession of the saint, right? Not because the saint does it. But I think people kind of get a little bit closer to thinking about the power of these individuals and the relics and the remains of their bodies in ways that putting the best spin I can on it, it has a little bit to do with the belief that the physical body is still something that is very connected to our souls and spirits.
It's extremely interesting. Do you have any insight on the time frame for the genesis of this practice? When did Christians begin doing this?
I think almost right away. If we think about Polycarp, and some of the early martyrs, people are already, the authorities are worried about people gathering up their remains, and we have it with the stories of Perpetua and Felicity. We have somebody blood, they catches the ring with the blood on it, and we see that Cyprian people are already dipping handkerchiefs into the blood after he's martyred in North Africa around 251. No, but so you have that very early, I think, and it's fascinating to me, and I have to think more about how this emerges and why I don't think it comes up out of a pre-existing tradition so much. It's a great puzzle to me, in the same way that I think Christian pilgrimage is very different. They're going to visit tombs and burial places and to have a Eucharist. They're not going to a temple of a god to sacrifice an animal. It's a really different practice. So I'm working on this still. I'm learning things about it as I go, but you caught me right in the middle of thinking about this recently. So
your expression has a very vividness and a freshness to it. Thank you so much for that insight. Very much appreciate that. Dr. Jensen, if I can close with this question. It's a question that I've been asking all of our viewers on this program, but I think it has a special pertinence to your research here, given that Cyprian, a North African theologian, was the first to write a systematic treatise on the unity of the church. Here's my question. What would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize this unity, and what can Christians today do to pursue real unity among the church? Thank you.
As a Roman Catholic woman and teaching many years in Protestant schools, I often encountered the question about why Catholics don't admit Protestants to Eucharist. And I think maybe there's a nub of the answer to your question in this story I'm going to tell. And so I try to, I think from outside, sometimes Catholics look like we get accused of not being hospitable. Jesus would have invited everybody to the table, I get told. Or that we think we're better and therefore they're not good enough to come with us, or that we don't think the same thing, which is closer to the reality. But I think the bottom line is not any of those things. The bottom line is that, I put it this way, you can't sleep with me till you've married me. It has to do with unity. And I think it still does have to do with unity. And so so that the Eucharist is the sacrament of unity. It's a sign of our unity. Now, it's tragic that we all are in different places and I'm fully on board with the idea of ecumenical, bilateral discussions, but we have to sort of decide what these sacraments mean and what they do. I mean, we have to find some consensus on that. And I don't know how soon we can do that, but I think that is the goal that we have to have. We all may have to sort of act as if we're ancient African bishops and meet in councils, like the way we do this and hash these things out, because fundamentally this is the sign of our unity, and it's also, unfortunately and tragically, the sign of our disunity. But we will have to work through that, and I think we can. I think we can make a commitment to doing it. I don't know how soon we will, and maybe not in my time, but I hope.
It's been our pleasure today to be speaking with Dr. Robin M. Jensen, the Patrick O'Brien Professor of Theology at Notre Dame University and author of the marvelous text that we've been discussing today, Christianity in Roman Africa, the Development of Its Practices and Beliefs, available from Erdman's Press in 2014. Dr. Jensen, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.